Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast. Ozcast. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
All right, so today we're diving into something that I think is on a lot of Australians' minds these days. That's right, the housing crisis. We've gotten a bunch of articles from you all about the Housing Australia Future Fund, the HAFF, And there's obviously a lot of debate around it, so we're going to try to break through that today and figure out, what this actually means for people trying to find a place to live. The government is saying that it's making progress, but one of the things that kind of jumped out at me is that apparently not a single home that's been funded by this HAFF has actually been built from scratch. So what's the real story here?
Well, it's certainly interesting, isn't it? You've got this $10 billion fund that launched back in June 2023 with this aim of building 30,000 affordable homes over 5 years. And on the surface, it looks like a pretty bold step towards tackling this housing shortage that Australia is facing.
Yeah, it sounds like exactly what we need, but I'm sensing coming.
Well, the coalition is saying that it hasn't quite delivered on those promises. They're pointing out that the government hasn't actually built any new homes through the fund, despite, claiming to be making progress. And they're even going so far as to say that no new homes have been built under any of the Labor government's housing policies, which include things like help to buy and build to rent.
Hold on, help to buy and build to rent. Can you just give us a quick breakdown of what those are, just so we're all on the same page?
Sure. So help to buy, that's designed to help first-time home buyers get into the market, essentially by providing government guarantees on a portion of their home loans. So, they need a smaller deposit. And build to rent encourages investment in rental properties by offering tax breaks to developers who build and hold rental properties for longer periods.
So it's kind of this two-pronged approach. One, to make homeownership more attainable, and the other to kind of increase the availability of rental properties. Okay, I get that. But going back to the HAFF, how is the government responding to these accusations from the opposition?
Well, they're saying they have made progress. They claim to have completed 358 homes, and another 7,833 are in the planning stages. But here's the thing. Senator Katie Gallagher admitted in a Senate hearing that 340 of those completed homes were actually existing homes that the government purchased. And they basically rebranded as HAF achievements. They're calling this acquired and converted.
Wait, so they're counting existing homes? And they didn't even build as part of their progress. That doesn't sound quite right.
Yeah, it's definitely raising some questions. The coalition argues that this acquiring and converting doesn't actually address the fundamental problem, which is the lack of overall housing supply. They say it's essentially a shell game, moving homes around instead of actually creating new ones. And it's led to some pretty strong statements coming from the opposition, like Michael Sukkar, who's the coalition's housing spokesman, saying acquiring homes that have already commenced or being completed does not count towards new home stock, and this is not what Labor promised. He even said that when it comes to increasing supply, Labor has waved the white flag, and no policy of Labor's has led to the completion of a single home.
Wow, they're not mincing words there, are they? But let's kind of put the political back and forth aside for a second and think about, the people on the ground. What does this acquired and converted approach actually mean for everyday Australians who are out there struggling to find affordable housing?
I think that's where the rubber really meets the road, right? It means that for somebody who's desperately searching for a place to live, the situation hasn't actually changed despite all these big announcements, these promises.
So even if the government hits its target of 30,000 homes through the HAFF, it's not actually going to mean that there are more affordable housing options out there for the people who need them most. That seems like kind of a disconnect there. Can we dig a little deeper into what this acquired and converted process actually looks like?
Essentially what's happening is the government is buying up homes that are already built or under construction, and then just labeling them as part of the HAFF. It's almost like buying a used car, giving it a new paint job, and then claiming that you built it yourself.
Okay, now that's an analogy I can get behind. So we've got this potentially misleading acquired and converted strategy going on, and on top of that, the coalition is saying that none of the government's policies have actually led to new homes being built. This is starting to paint a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, it is concerning, and I think it really begs the question, is the government genuinely committed to solving this housing crisis? Or are they more focused on creating this illusion of progress?
That's a big question, and it's one we definitely need to explore further. But before we do that, I'm curious to hear what you think. What's standing out to you so far in all of this?
Well, I think,
Oh.
you know, it's a very complex situation, and I think what really strikes me is how this debate really highlights the disconnect
Yeah.
between political rhetoric
Yeah.
and the actual experience of people who are struggling to find housing. It's a complex situation.
Yeah.
And I think what really strikes me is how this debate really highlights the disconnect between, that political rhetoric and then the actual experiences of people who are struggling to find housing out there.
Yeah, you're right. It's really easy to get lost in the numbers and the back and forth. But, we have to remember that this is about real people's lives. We're talking about families who are getting priced out of the market, young people who can't afford to move out, individuals who are just struggling to keep a roof over their heads.
Exactly. And I think this acquired and converted strategy, while it might be well-intentioned, it kind of risks overlooking the deeper systemic issues that are at play here.
Yeah, it feels like a Band-Aid solution, something that creates a temporary sense of relief but doesn't actually address that underlying problem of, inadequate housing supply. So if we're thinking about, long-term solutions here, what needs to happen? What are some alternative approaches that could actually make a difference?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to move beyond this idea that simply shifting existing housing stock around is enough. We need to be building more homes, and that requires a multi-pronged approach.
Okay, so let's break that down. What would that look like?
I think it could involve things like revisiting zoning regulations to allow for more density in urban areas, streamlining planning processes to make it easier and faster to build, offering incentives to developers to build more affordable housing options.
Right, so it sounds like we need a mix of policy changes,
Okay.
incentives, maybe even some fresh thinking about how we approach housing in general.
Absolutely, and I think there are some interesting examples from other countries that we could learn from. For instance, modular construction, where homes are built off-site in factories and then assembled on location. That's proven to be a much faster and more cost-effective way to build in some places.
That's really interesting. It seems like thinking outside the box like that could be really valuable. But what about in the immediate term? I mean, these longer-term solutions are going to take time to implement, but people need help now. What can be done to alleviate the pressure in the meantime?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one immediate step could be increasing rental assistance for low-income families so they can actually afford their current housing. And another is investing more in social housing projects that are specifically designed to provide affordable options for those who need it most.
Right, so it's kind of like creating a safety net. While we're working on these bigger, more systemic changes.
Exactly, and I think it's really crucial that we learn from the criticisms that have been leveled at the HAFF and ensure that any new initiatives are truly adding to that housing supply and not just repackaging what's already there.
Right, we don't want to fall into that trap again. But I think it's also important to remember that this isn't just a problem for the government to solve. It's something that we all need to be thinking about and engaging with.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the future of housing in Australia really depends on our collective willingness to demand better and to push for solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
Yeah, and this whole conversation has really gotten me thinking about the power of individual action. Like, what can everyday Australians do to actually make a difference in this space?
There's so many ways to get involved. You can contact your elected officials, let them know that affordable housing is a priority for you. You can support organizations that are working on the ground to provide housing and advocacy services. You can educate yourself about the issues, engage in conversations like this one, share what you've learned with others.
I love all of those ideas. It's so easy to feel powerless when you're faced with such a big problem. But it sounds like there are concrete steps that we can all take to contribute to finding solutions.
Absolutely. And remember, even small actions can have a ripple effect. Speaking up, raising awareness, demanding better. These things can create real change over time.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in shaping the future that we want to see. Now, I know we've been talking a lot about the Australian context, but these issues aren't unique to Australia, are they?
Not at all.
No.
Housing affordability is a global challenge, and many countries are grappling with very similar problems.
So what can we learn from each other? Are there any innovative approaches being implemented elsewhere that could potentially be adapted to the Australian context?
Definitely, I think so. For example, some cities in Europe have had a lot of success with co-housing models, where residents share some common spaces and resources. And this can create more affordable and community-oriented living arrangements.
That's a really interesting concept, sharing resources and building community around housing. It seems like a win-win, like we're kind of rethinking what it means to live in a modern society.
Yeah, it really challenges traditional notions of housing and encourages a more collaborative and sustainable approach.
Thinking back to where we started this conversation, with that striking image of the government essentially rebranding existing homes as progress, it's encouraging to now be talking about these innovative and forward-thinking solutions. It feels like there's hope for a future where everyone has access to safe and affordable and dignified housing.
I agree. And while the challenges are significant, it's important to maintain that sense of optimism and to believe that change is possible.
Absolutely. But optimism needs to be coupled with action. And speaking of action, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far and consider what this all means for you, our listener. What are the key takeaways that you can apply to your own life, whether you're directly impacted by the housing crisis or you just want to be a more informed and engaged citizen?
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive into Australia's housing crisis. We started by really unpacking that controversy surrounding the Housing Australia Future Fund and that acquired and converted strategy. And then we kind of broadened the conversation to explore, what are some potential solutions out there? What are some alternative approaches, both in Australia and around the world?
Yeah, and I think as we wrap up, it's really crucial to bring it back to that individual listener. What does this all mean for you no matter where you live? Yeah, that's a great point. It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by the scale of this problem, but I think one of the key takeaways here is that we all have a role to play, whether it's staying informed or engaging in these conversations or advocating for change. Our individual actions can collectively make a difference.
Exactly. And one way to stay engaged is to keep asking those critical questions. Is your local government doing enough to address housing affordability? Are there community initiatives that you can support? Are there innovative solutions being implemented elsewhere that could be adapted to your own community?
Yeah, and don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's the best way.
Absolutely. We need to be open to new ideas and creative solutions. And, change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, it takes persistence,
Yeah.
and it takes a collective effort.
So as we conclude this deep dive, we'll leave you with this thought. Housing is more than just bricks and mortar. It's about security, stability, and really that foundation for a thriving life. And ensuring that everyone has access to safe and affordable housing is a challenge that we have to face head on together. Thanks for joining us.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.